In the early hours of the morning of June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers swept across the frontier and penetrated deep into the Soviet Union. Then they received their first shock. The fierce resistance they anticipated failed to materialize. Instead, they were greeted by the overwhelming majority of the population as liberators, and at every village and town they entered, crowds emerged to welcome them with the traditional offering of bread and salt. This unexpected reception was not a manifestation of widespread pro-Nazism. It was the Russian people's first opportunity to escape from the terrorism of a regime that the United States government branded as, quote, as intolerable and as alien, unquote, as Nazism since the end of the Civil War in 1920. Neither was the spirit of revolt limited to the civil population. Mass surrenders of Red soldiers became an everyday occurrence, and the majority of the prisoners immediately petitioned the German Supreme Command for permission to take up arms and fight alongside the Wehrmacht against a common enemy and to liberate their homeland. Within 5 months of the invasion, the Germans had collected 2,053,000 prisoners, and by March 1, 1942, the staggering total of 3,600,000. In the forefront of the millions who refused to defend the communist state structure were the Cossacks, inveterate enemies of Stalin and all forms of dictatorship. Hitler, blinded by the racial policy of the former Russian Alfred Rosenberg, refused to accept the Russian anti-communists as allies. Quote, it must never be permitted that anyone but the Germans bear arms. This is particularly important, even if in immediate terms it appears easier to draw on some other conquered nations for armed assistance. This is wrong. One day it shall hit out against us, inevitably and unavoidably. Only the Germans may bear arms, not the Slavs, not the Czech, not the Cossack, or the Ukrainian. Unquote. Even before Operation Barbarossa, the codename for the invasion of the Soviet Union, was launched, Hitler had issued to all army commanders on the eastern borders orders recommending, quote, the harshest and most ruthless measures, unquote, to be used when dealing with the Russians, irrespective of the individual's political orientation. And it was this untermenschen, subhuman, policy which occasioned the mass starvation of hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners of war during the winter of 1941-42. Fortunately, this aspect of Nazi racialism did not extend to many frontline commanders who, in direct defiance of Hitler's orders, started to recruit Russian volunteer units instead of condemning the Red Army defectors to POW death camps. And the Cossacks, being world-renowned for their fighting prowess, were among the very first to be utilized. The first wholesale anti-communist defection of Cossacks to the German lines took place on August 22, 1941, near Mogilev, where Major Ivan Nikitich Kononov and his 436th Regiment defected. Ivan Kononov was born on April 2, 1900, the son of a Don Cossack captain in the Novonikoliev-skoye Stanitsa. Stanitsa is a Cossack village. His father, true to Cossack tradition, spent all his life as a soldier. During World War I, he was badly wounded and was still in hospital when Russia collapsed. In 1918, he had recovered sufficiently to return to his native Stanitsa, but when the communists occupied it, they hanged him and shot his wife. Young Ivan finished his primary schooling in 1910, and the following year passed the entrance examination to the high school in Mariupol, where he lived with his aunt. It was she who, following the murder of his parents, suggested that he volunteer to serve in the Red Army, and so disguise his bourgeois background. Having enlisted as a laborer, Kononov was a simple soldier in 1920, serving in the 14th Cossack Division of Badeni's 1st Cavalry Army. 2 years later, he completed a course for junior officers, and promotion came rapidly after that. By 1927, he had successfully completed a course at the Moscow Military Academy and was a platoon commander in the 27th Regiment, 5th Blinov Cavalry Division. While serving in the Blinov Division, he held various commands and remained there until 1935, when he entered the Frunze Military Academy. Qualifying as a General Staff Officer, he was posted to the operational staff of the 2nd Corps of the Red Army. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in 1940, he was sent into action as commanding officer of the 436th Infantry Regiment and, because of his ability and gallantry on the battlefield, was subsequently awarded the Order of the Red Star. And it was as a major commanding the 436th Regiment that he found himself facing the advancing Wehrmacht in the summer of 1941. Major Kononov can be described as a typical Red Army officer. As far back as 1924, he had been a member of the Komsomol, Communist Youth Organization, and from 1927 until the day he went over to the Germans, he was a member of the Soviet Communist Party. But, as with so many Russians, his membership was a mere formality, and he hated the regime he was serving, and waited for the day to come when he could strike a blow against it. Even prior to the Finno-Soviet War, Kononov had been contemplating how he could assist in the destruction of the communist system, yet he could see no signs of a widespread revolt being organized. There were too many Red spies, and he knew that if a revolt was to be successful, he would have to receive external assistance. This was something that Finland was not in a position to give, so he waited. He chose his moment carefully. On August 3, 1941, his regiment had launched a successful and daring counterattack against the Germans. During the heat of the battle, with only a few trusted officers knowing his plans for the future, Kononov sent an emissary over to the Germans to inform them that he had elected to join them with his entire regiment to form the nucleus of a, quote, Russian Liberation Army, unquote. The emissary returned with a written guarantee of safety from the opposing German commander, and the news that the German Army High Command had accepted his plan. At the same time as his return, a Major Pozhniakov arrived from the nearby Red 61st Divisional HQ to congratulate Kononov on his recent victory and to inform him that he was being recommended for a suitable decoration. Within hours of Major Pozhniakov's departure, Kononov assembled the regiment. Quote, My victorious soldiers, I want to speak to you from my heart and not with my head. I have decided that this is the moment to declare war upon Stalin and the communist regime, and therefore I intend to cross the front line with as many of you as may wish to accompany me. Those of you who want to join me in fighting for Mother Russia, stand to the right, and those who wish to remain go to the left. Unquote. He promised those who wished to stay that no pressure would be brought to bear upon them to make them change their minds, or would he think any less of them for having reached that decision. Everyone went to the right. His men, who called him Batka or Papa, felt as he did down to the newest recruit. The Germans were very surprised when the entire regiment joined them. They had not believed that such a thing was possible, and therefore they had made no plans to receive and billet them. When accommodations had been found for them, General von Schenkendorf invited Major Kononov and his fellow officers to a party, where the major again appealed for the formation of a Russian Liberation Army, and stressed his belief that the Russians, detesting Stalin, would then launch a counter-revolution from European Russia to the Pacific coastline and destroy communism once and for all time. Schenkendorf fully agreed with his proposals and, without paying any attention to Hitler's dictates, authorized Kononov to form the 102nd Cossack Regiment, whose regimental banner later carried this inscription, Down with Soviet rule, long live the free Cossacks, Kononov. Cossacks and other nations of Russia who have united in struggle to liberate the people of Russia. Before long, the Cossack Regiment was in action in the front line, as well as against Red partisan bands, and each time it went into action, more Red soldiers joined to swell its ranks. To Cossacks everywhere, the 102nd Regiment meant hope for the future. Riding from Berlin on December 20th, 1941, the famous Cossack general Peter N. Krasnov hero of the Russian Civil War and author of numerous books, including the outstanding From Double-Headed Eagle to Red Flag, wrote this to Major Kononov. Dear Ivan Nikitich, please accept on behalf of myself and all former Cossack officers and men our sincere greetings. We are all watching with great interest your remarkable achievements in the fight against communism. Our quiet Don, Kuban, Terek, and Ural are awaiting liberation, and for them, as for us, you are our only hope. We can assure you that we are all with you in spirit, and wish you personal good health and many future successes." Unquote. However, the dream of a Russian liberation army was not to be realized. Despite his earlier order, Hitler had been ignored, and hundreds of Russian units were serving alongside the Wehrmacht, although most of them were comparatively small. In view of developments, Hitler issued Order Number 215, dated January 13, 1942, which emphasized that no Russian unit was to be more than battalion strength, and that in every case the officers of such units were to be German and, if possible, the NCOs as well. The idea being, quote, so as to indicate that the ordinary Russian soldier is good, but not the officers or NCOs, unquote. Hitler was being forced to eat his own words. Only 3 months earlier he had told the German people, quote, "The German soldier opposes an enemy who, I must admit, does not consist of human beings but of animals, of beasts. We have now seen what Bolshevism can make of men. We cannot even hope to give the people back home an idea of what we have seen. It is the most horrible thing ever conjured up by a human brain. An enemy who fights on the one hand out of sheer bestial thirst for blood, coupled with cowardice and fear of commissars on the other. That is the country our soldiers now have come to know after almost 25 years of Bolshevik rule." Unquote. Yet again, General von Scheckendorf chose to ignore the Fuhrer. He simply changed the title of the 102nd Cossack Regiment to the 600th Don Cossack Battalion without reducing its size, and left Kononov and his officers in sole command without any German overseers. Due to the successes achieved by the 600th Don Battalion in the autumn of 1942, Kononov was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and some 200 Cossack battalions could be found scattered along the length of the German front. The case of Kononov's Cossack hatred of the Soviet system was by no means unique. According to a survey carried out by the Postwar Institute for the Study of History and Culture of the USSR in Munich, Germany, and based upon Soviet statistics, this was the state of mind of the Cossackhood in the early days of the German-Soviet War. Occupied provinces or regions. Don and Cuban. Town, % anti-German, 11, % anti-Soviet, 85, % indifferent, 4. Village, % anti-German, 4, % anti-Soviet, 87, % indifferent, 9. North Caucasus region. Town, % anti-German, 6, % anti-Soviet, 86, % indifferent, 8. Village, % anti-German, 4, % anti-Soviet, 76, % indifferent, 20. Those percentages were amply substantiated by the reaction of the Cossack population, as General Kustring advanced towards the Caucasus in the summer of 1942, and the army group of Field Marshal von Weichs marched into the northern region between the rivers Don and Volga. Whereas the Soviet officials and a few staunch communists fled at the approach of the Germans, the Cossacks did everything they could to remain behind and fall into German hands. Thousands of younger men went into hiding so that the Soviets could not forcibly evacuate them. The Wehrmacht captured Novocherkassk on the River Don early in August 1942, but as a result of the Stalin scorched earth policy, forcible evacuation plus German reluctance to restore civil order, chaos reigned in the town and surrounding countryside. Then, when the Germans did decide to act, They made the mistake of using the former Soviet machine, which still harbored a proportion of communists who had been instructed to remain in the rear to act as saboteurs. This alarmed the population and, to add to their misgivings, Stalin had ensured that everyone knew how the Nazis had starved to death more than 1 million Russian soldiers who went west looking for a way to wage war upon communism. This state of affairs did not last very long. When the last vestiges of communism had retreated from the vast rural areas, the laws of the Cossackhood reasserted themselves. In every stanitsa, atamans, chief spokesmen, were democratically elected. The hated collective farms were dissolved and private ownership, according to tradition, restored. The cattle, other livestock, and farming machinery were divided up and, to guard their newly found freedom, sotnias, a cavalry unit comprising 100 horsemen, were formed, first in Mechetinskaya, then in Golubinskaya, and later throughout the entire area. While this was happening, the Terek Cossacks received a surprise. One of their dead heroes, Nikolai Lazarevich Kulakov, who had allegedly died from wounds he had received during the Civil War, came back to life to lead them against the communists. The story of Kulakov all started in January 1920, when the 1st Volga Regiment of the Volunteer Anti-Communist Army was making a fighting retreat toward the Black Sea under extreme pressure from a numerically superior Red Army. Snow and ice hampered the retreat, and the numerous battlefields were easily distinguished by the blood-soaked snow. It was on such a battlefield near Kavkazskaya that Lieutenant Nikolai Kulakov, deputy commander of the regiment, was deploying his men to face yet another Red onslaught. The battle was savage. No mercy was shown by either side. Then the Red gunners found the correct range, and a shell exploded only a few feet away from the lieutenant. Mercifully, he was knocked unconscious, only to awake some time later to find himself being painfully jolted along in a ramshackle old cart. His legs were a twisted mass of sinew, muscle, and blood. The ambulance, such as it was, duly arrived at Kavkazskaya railroad station, where he was put onto a waiting train. The doctors tried to relieve his agony with the limited medical means at their disposal, but it was too late to save his legs, and when the train arrived at Pashkovskaya, they were both amputated. It was then that his numerous friends, for he was already a famous figure, thought that his 20 years of soldiering were over. While still recovering from the crude anesthetic, he was told a woman was waiting to see him. He had no idea who it could be, as he knew no one in that desolate place. It was his wife Dasha, who had been searching for him ever since she had heard the news that he had been wounded. Together they were taken to Novorossiysk, where they hoped they would be safe. They were not. Again the volunteer army had to retreat, and the order to retire came so unexpectedly that there was no time to evacuate the wounded. Despite the valiant efforts of his wife to hide him from the Red Army, Kulakov was captured. Dasha went from office to office, pleading with everyone she could find to listen to her. "My husband is dying, so you have no need of him," she would say. "Let him return with me to die in peace." Her eloquence was rewarded, and on a warm July day in Ekaterinodar, where Kulakov had been imprisoned, he was released only to find that the communist headhunters, the Cheka, were waiting for him. The Cheka asked him to fill in a form, and after discussing what he should write with his wife, he decided to tell the truth. As a former Cossack officer, an enemy of the Soviets, he was transferred to a brickworks which the Cheka had transformed into a massive torture and slaughterhouse. Nearly out of her wits with anxiety, Dasha again started the endless round of visiting Red officials, pleading for her husband's life, asking that he be allowed to die in peace. Again her efforts were successful, and she was given permission to take him back to their native stanitsa. They arrived home late one night and were welcomed by Dasha's uncle and Kulikov's 3-year-old son, Kolya. But it was not a joyful reunion. Her uncle had bad news. The local Cheka were going to arrest Kulikov the following morning. All night long the couple worked while Kulikov lay helpless watching them, and by morning they had dug a secret cellar under the floor of the entrance hall. Being sure that it was only a matter of time before the communists were defeated, Nikolai Kulikov entered the tomb without any misgivings. Days went past. The days became months and the months years, and Kulikov became a legend. Dasha had told the Cheka that her husband had died on their way back home. He stayed in his grave until the Red Army was driven from the stanitsa, and then, putting on his carefully kept uniform and buckling on his sword, he emerged into a world of day and night instead of a life of permanent darkness. On wooden legs that he had carved himself to pass the long and lonely hours, Nikolai Kulikov went from stanitsa to stanitsa in a matroika, a 3-horse-drawn carriage, calling upon his fellow Terek Cossacks to form sotnias and take up the struggle against Stalin and communism. Back in Novocherkassk, the Cossack population elected yet another quote-unquote dead Civil War hero to be their ataman, Sergei V. Pavlov. Anxious to counteract the German actions in the town and to form independent Cossack units, Ataman Pavlov established, without any help from the Germans, a Cossack military and civil headquarters. Sergei Pavlov was born the son of a Cossack officer in Novocherkassk in 1896 and, after passing through the Cadet Corps School of the Don and the Nikolaevsky Cavalry School, graduated as a second lieutenant in 1914. Like millions of others, he went straight into the front line and into the annals of Cossackhood. Awarded the Sword of St. George and other decorations for gallantry, he volunteered for service in the Air Force in 1916. Owing to the slow training schedule, he was too late to go into action against the Germans again as a pilot. Before he graduated, with honors, the February Kerensky 1917 revolution broke out, and then came Lenin and the communists.